this and being neurodiverse, I ended up in a range of jobs that were just like a terrible fit, the opposite of what I should have been doing. And then I finally got a job in IT support, which I actually really enjoyed. And then I ended up just helping faculty who were having disabilities problems, and it became clear they needed more support than just, showing them how to create a test in Canvas, which is our learning management system. So my boss created a role for me. I did a extensive training, so now I can meet with them and really give them advice that I'm qualified to give. So what does digital accessibility mean? It means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. More specifically, people can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, i.e. use the internet, and contribute to it. So you want to tweet something, you want to post to a forum board, if anybody still posts to forum boards, you want to send an email. All of this needs to work for people who are blind, who are hard of hearing, who might have physical disabilities. They may have a hand tremor. They may not be able to use their arms, may not be able to use their legs. They may be in a wheelchair. There's a whole spectrum of issues, and digital accessibility looks at all of them. And we also go by a belief of the universal design that when you make things inclusive for people who are having issues, it becomes better for everybody, right? So even if you don't have a disability, being able to see auto captions is pretty great. Or, oh, I need to transcribe this. And instead of typing it up myself, I can use an app and it will transcribe it for me. And then I can search it and find what I need in 3 minutes. So that's a basic overview. The W3C that I cited here is the World Wide Web Consortium. They are the organization that oversees the policies that websites and apps should conform to. They also oversee the guidelines that websites and apps must conform to be considered accessible. Couple disability laws, these may have been covered by other speakers. I haven't been able to come to most of these. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is kind of the most well-known law. An example is just this week, Title II updated it. So web content and mobile app accessibility is required for state governments, public places. It didn't totally say universities, but universities are held to that standard by a different title. So it said this guidance describes how state and local governments and businesses open to the public can make sure that their websites are accessible to people with disabilities as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. I've linked all of this because, like most things to do with the government, everything's like 2 pages long. So the second one, Rehabilitation Act of 1973, this was a really groundbreaking law. It was the first one they could finally get through and get signed to establish a baseline of protection. So Section 504, you cannot be denied an education at a university due to a disability. There's multiple sections to this, and I did not do it justice, but I just kind of wanted to give an overview. Section 508 is really important, especially in the world of digital accessibility. All government contractors and government agencies must use accessible PDFs and digital content. So on top of which, all content submitted to the government in digital form must be accessible. This means that if you're at a university and you are submitting a grant, your PDFs need to be accessible. If you are a contractor and you submit a PDF, you need to make sure that it is accessible and meets these Section 508 guidelines before you submit it. If you are a government agency and you put things online for the general public to use and it is not accessible, they could sue you. But there are areas where you can file complaints. So This has created a lot of jobs, good jobs actually, well-paid jobs. Contractors who work with the government hire accessibility testers to make sure that all of their digital content Section 508 compliant. Sometimes it's just like freelance work on Upwork. Sometimes they hire people full-time, usually full-time, who are certified. They go through all the websites, all the PDFs, all the Word documents. I mean, everything. They use both, like automated tools, and then they go through it manually and they make sure that the links aren't broken. That is working with the screen readers. I mean, it's kind of really going through it step by step and making sure it conforms to the guidelines, um, because it has to. And the government is usually pretty strict about this. There is a certification. I don't know why it's under the Department of Homeland Security. I have theories, but I have no idea really. There is a trust, trusted tester program certification, and a lot of federal contractors require that the people they hire to do this accessibility testing are certified. And you take a Section 508 training, which is possibly the most boring training I've ever done in my life besides algebra. And then you take a large exam, and it walks you through every guideline specified. It does not summarize it in fun terms. It is the technical details, and you have to read it, and then it gives you examples, and then you walk through examples, and you have to say, this is not, conforming to guidelines. This only partially conforms. So WCAG is the guideline set out for digital accessibility by the Web Accessibility Initiative. There's a lot of acronyms, so I try not to use too many, which is actually a guideline set forth within WCAG, which is that you define your acronyms, but you also try to avoid any unnecessary ones. Hard to do here. The acronym POUR, P-O-U-R, is the acronym covers the main principle. If you ever take a fundamentals of accessibility, this will be one of the first things you go through. So the first one is perceivable. So this is things you can perceive, such as seeing, hearing. I mean, you don't usually touch, but so captions, alt text describes an image if it's important for understanding the content. If it's just a funny meme or a nice picture, you mark it as decorative. A screen reader, which reads out what's on the screen, whether it's a document, it can read out the document, will either use the alt text to describe the image to the user, or if it's decorative, it just skips it and keeps going. Audio descriptions are for people who can't hear. You describe what you're hearing. There's guidelines for this. I'm bringing in a speaker in the next couple of months, who is one of the best in the field. If anybody's interested in looking her up or listening to her talks, her name's Bronwyn Andrea Aquesa, and she was the audio describer for the John F. Kennedy Center. She does audio description for movies, musicals, plays, and her trainings are just really interesting, but she gives very good feedback on how you go about describing it, what's necessary. One of the things is like, why is it being said? Which things are important to describe and which are not. Uh, in terms of perceivable, you may need to make sure your color ratio is correct. So given that I work at a university and I started just doing like learning management support, I would see a lot of classes where the teacher decided to make things colorful. This results in some really terrible color combinations like pink on yellow or purple with a green background. And some of it, even if you don't have any vision issues, is hard to read. So you can imagine if you're low vision that or colorblind, that if you have a green background with red text, which is the most common color blindness, that would just be a mess for you. But also these don't fit this ratio that you have to fit to be in conformance. So I appreciate every professor's enthusiasm, but please don't go all over the board with colors, because it can make it really hard for people who are low vision. The second one is O for operable. So the buttons work. The keyboard shortcuts actually work. You press F5, it does what F5 is supposed to do. If you press F5, you're able to also go back. You don't get stuck. You give your users enough time to read, easily find content, etc. If you've ever watched a video and the words are just going by, and you're like, this seemed like it was going to be a great video, but it went by way too fast, then you've experienced this. Understandable, the language is set. What that means is that you can go into documents, websites, and you can actually say like the language should be English. It's kind of like, in the source code or wherever, but there's always somewhere you can go set that as an official setting, and you should. Plain speak, which means you don't make it more complicated than necessary. Obviously, at a university level, this might be different, but I think I saw a statistic that a large percentage of Americans have a fifth grade comprehension level. So you're going to want to make it as understandable as possible, as concise as possible, to make it understandable to the greatest amount of readers possible. Content should be in a predictable way. I always think of this like if you're in a online class and one thing is here, but then something's way over here, and you're going, why is everything out of order? We often meet with faculty to help them kind of create a predictable order where it's like week 1, week 2, or there's categories. It's not just a ton of files that are named like XYZ.12. And then robust. So it's created to work with present and future assistive technology. Sorry, I abbreviated that, but the abbreviation is AT. So this would really mean it's working with common screen readers. Every large piece of software that most universities or institutions would purchase come with a template called the acronym is VPAT, Voluntary Product Assessment Template. And it outlines what conforms to these guidelines and what doesn't from an accessibility standpoint. So for example, we had a student who wanted to know how Kurzweil, which is a common screen reader, would work with Canvas. I went to the VPAT, it didn't list Kurzweil as being one of the screen readers they tested. So then we had to get a license and test it out. Kurzweil can also be speech to text as well. So this was an example of, yeah, we have it, but we have a VPAT, but in this situation, it didn't totally do it. So really looking when you acquire software systems, take a look at it, see how comprehensive that is. I don't acquire software. I'm not in the compliance world. But if you are involved in, considering different software or web systems, and you are part of that committee, usually it's a committee, people who are acquiring these things, request a VPAT. It will show you whether this is a legit software or not. If they don't have a VPAT, they're not very established. That is a sign that like they haven't done all their homework, and might want to at least email them and say, do you have this? Would you provide it? Like, I would not spend any money on software that did not provide a VPAT, either by default, or if you email them and say, hey, could I get this? And they don't have it, that's really a red flag. WCAG comes with different versions. The newest one is 2.2, and it's mainly focused on cognitive diversity. So this can range from somebody who has a hand tremor and Parkinson's, having trouble pushing a button, to somebody who has ADD and is getting distracted, or autism who's just like overwhelmed by like flashing things and, just like this is too much, which I think even if you don't have autism, the internet now is so covered with ads and flashing pictures and everything that anything you can cut out from that is really great. And the WCAG guidelines cover all of these things. They're pretty comprehensive. And every time they update them, there's more guidelines. And then every contractor has to do the professional development so they understand and can implement those newer guidelines. Sometimes when I see people say, we should add more guidelines, I think we already have quite a few guidelines, but it's fair. There is a committee who decides on these, like, yes, this makes sense. Maybe we'll work on that next time. So these are the common scenarios. Someone is deaf or hard of hearing. Low vision means, they're not blind, but they have pretty severe eye vision impairments. I saw a statistic that at Pitt, of the faculty and staff who registered with our Disability Resources Services office, like 42% of those who reported it had a chronic illness, which would make it really hard to just like put forth 100% every day. And so there's ways we can help them. So if they're having a low energy day or they're struggling, we can find methods to help them in terms of assistive technology. I've worked with clients who have traumatic brain injury. Maybe they were in a car accident, maybe they had epilepsy. It could be a whole variety of things. So some of the effects of that can be migraines. So some of them have to limit their screen time. So if you're in academia and you need to be reading emails and reading the newest research, then limiting your screen time is a pretty scary thing to hear. But there's a whole lot of accessibility tools out there. So we have them learn how to use Adobe's screen reader, which I think is called Read Aloud. They all have similar names like that. And it reads it out to them and they can do something else. So they're not getting behind in updating themselves on research. Microsoft has its own suite of accessibility tools, so it could read emails out. So they really like prioritize which things am I going to read today and which will I listen to. ADD, there's all kinds of focusing tools now. Dyslexia, same with that. Autism, there's more research out there about ways to make websites more accessible for them. Hand tremors is an example that was specifically mentioned in a use case for the newest guidelines. So example one, we were creating a sign up form for this program I put together. We have somebody who was making it and we just met on Zoom. And she, I was saying, I want this, I want that. And so, there's a drop down that says, are you student, faculty, staff? Or there's a box you fill in that says your first name and your last name. And on the right-hand side of the system we use, which is called Airtable, it allowed you to make all of the buttons and entry areas bigger. And I told her to do so because that is also covered in WCAG guidelines. So like if you have a hand tremor, or if you just find it difficult to be like typing in, this creates more space. It also creates more space between the buttons. So instead of cancel and confirm being basically right next to each other, it spaces out a little better. And it's responsive, which means it is accessible both on a cell phone, a tablet, or the website. But those are things I think about, and those are things that are kind of easy to implement when you're creating these types of things. So a WCAG guideline that I was kind of thinking about was, people press the wrong buttons because they're too small or the spacing is too small. So I was just like kind of thinking about that. So when I saw that there was an option to automatically make everything bigger, I said, do it. Another example is, if you're neurodiverse, you may find sudden videos on websites distracting, frustrating, stressful. Also, if you have epilepsy and a seizure can be triggered by flashing lights, this is also an issue that the WCAG guidelines go over. So the WCAG guideline here is that you have to avoid anything that flashes more than 3 times in any 1 second period. So if you have something on a web page that flashes, it can flash no more than 3 times. And that's something that like an accessibility tester would be looking for. It's on all the exams and everything. It's important to think about all this. As Adobe in one of its posts said, video is the most popular content online. And I guess this is a little old, but would account for 82% of all web traffic by 2022. So making sure that it's got captions and that they're correct is important. Making sure the captions give people enough time to actually read them before it moves on is important. Um, Transcripts, offering them so in an easy to find place is also important. That's something we go over with faculty and staff if they're uploading, lecture videos, is making sure their students can also find the transcript and easily download it. So if I sat down with somebody, and this is just kind of talking about these types of jobs and different things we do, I go over things like the You Do It Cloud, where it tests Canvas classes for accessibility issues. It shows you where they are, what they are, and it offers you guidance on how to fix them. Canvas has a accessibility checker that looks for other content in its pages. A lot of these kind of like automated tools do some things, but not all of the things, which is why it's important for, teaching these faculty and staff, because when you look at the fine print, it says, well, we test this, but we don't test that. And so you can't assume that everything's going to be accessible just because you use this one tool. They're helpful, like they'll find, broken links, but they're not going to go through all your PDF files in Canvas and make sure that those are all accessible. You'll have to go through those yourself. Account settings have accessibility tools. We use a platform for videos called Panopto. So you can go in and edit the captions. You can make sure the transcript's correct. You can put in audio description, which was only rolled out maybe in the last 2 years, I think. So we're still training people on what that means, how to do it effectively, which is why bringing in a speaker to talk about that is really useful. Microsoft has the immersive reader. It is good for people who either want the content read out loud, might have dyslexia, again, might be cutting down on their screen time or busy doing something else and they just want it read out loud to them. There's a variety of scenarios where something like that is useful. And it's easy to integrate into a lot of these learning management systems. We also use something called Name Coach, which allows students to record how to say their name correctly. There's a lot of benefits to this, but we often have to explain what it does to faculty because they're kind of bombarded with a lot of technical information regularly. So just sitting down with them and taking the time to say, this is what this does, and it's a good idea because X, Y, and Z can really make a difference. So this is kind of an unofficial checklist of things I would tell any client, whether it's at a university or business or government. The missing alt text. If you use PowerPoint, Adobe's PDF reader, they all have accessibility checkers and they all look for this. So this is that description of an image. This is always kind of one of the first things people think of or talk about when they talk about accessibility. Insufficient color contrast. This is that, yellow background with purple font. Dear God. There is actually a guideline on that, this color contrast. There's different levels of conformance. So there's a level A, which is kind of your most basic. Double A, which is kind of the standard amongst educational institutions, a lot of like small, medium businesses. Double A is kind of like that's what most people are going for. Triple A requires a whole lot more in terms of conformance, time, effort, but some things are required to be AAA, which is really when you bring in a specialist who knows that conformance and can check, okay, this actually meets the AAA guideline. Whereas, like, so the AAA guideline is a higher contrast ratio. I think it's like 7:2, but this meets most conformance guidelines. This can be a little dry to talk about. Broken links. So you link to something on CNN and it's no longer there. Sorry. File names that, XYZ.2.7. We often encourage our faculty and staff to name their files with names that will help the students know what they're downloading. Clear organizational structure, whether that's for your class or your website or your app, our brains are looking for a pattern. The faster they can find the pattern, the faster they can navigate whatever it is. So transcripts and captions, whether that's Panopto at a university or your YouTube or your website, wherever you're hosting all this, there should be a downloadable transcript and you should have gone through your captions and made sure they're correct. And then sometimes in Canvas, students will say, hey, we're supposed to download this file, but we can't find it. And so usually it's in the wrong section. And this happens on websites too, right? Like you go to download a file and it doesn't work. It's probably being hosted in the wrong folder. So that's something that both an automated tool would look for, but then you might need to bring in somebody who, your web designer, and email them and say, hey, like you put it in the wrong folder and nobody can download it, put it in this folder. So an accessibility specialist or a web developer should be looking for that, and they will be looking for that. But web developers have a lot on their plate, so sometimes they like miss this stuff. So bigger companies or governments will have accessibility folks work with the web developers and the web designers as a team to try to make sure it's all copacetic. These are the tools that are suggested by the DHS trusted tester thing, but there's a whole lot of other tools, but I like to put the official one. So Andy is a extension that you put in your browser, and it'll start showing you accessibility issues. The color contrast analyzer, it's free, just like Andy. It's looking at those color ratios for you. Wave will also look for accessibility issues like color ratio. And then the W3C has a long list. And there's always companies coming out with new tools. There's apps now, there's other extensions, and accessibility folks, a lot of us have like 10 extensions and I can't remember what half of them do, but I have a couple core ones that are pinned to my menu bar. So these are some of your popular assistive tech tools. So screen readers, they read out what's on the screen. So JAWS was the first one that came out. Kurzweil, NVIDIA, which is free, but it only works on a PC. VoiceOver, which is the Apple version. Screen magnifier. So a lot of like computers and websites, they can zoom into about 200%. But for a lot of people with impaired vision, they need to go beyond 200, which is when you start either buying software or you check your accessibility tools on your computer to see if it has a screen magnifier. So this is going to make it go up to 400%. I have had clients who really need it much bigger than 200. 200 is still too small for them. So I'll see if the one on their computer works well enough for them, or I'll probably suggest that they get Zoom Text, which is a popular one. Um, as long as they register their disability with the Disability Service Office, their department is required to provide this software for them. So this has been an issue because one, a lot of faculty and staff didn't even know that they should go to our disability office to register a disability. Then they were afraid to do so because they were afraid that if anyone found out, they would think that, oh, you can't read as well. Well, how are you keeping up with your research? So they were trying to keep it sort of under wraps. But if they had gone to our disability office and, given all the paperwork you have to give, and their dean in any way came across as, discriminating, they have legal recourse. They have legal protections. But by just trying to keep it quiet, they don't have those legal protections. They're better off going and registering so that they have some legal protection and so their department has to pay for one of these things than they are by just trying to keep it quiet. Because at a certain point, disabilities, have effects. And as much as they may not want that to happen, or as hard as they may try, um, if you can't see the blue button in Canvas, you can't create the exam. Or if you can't, see a lot of things you need to see to just do your day-to-day job, it's going to take a toll. So in all of my trainings, my meetings with clients, I really explain this over and over again because they are so much better off by going to DRS, registering their disability, and having some legal protections than they are by just trying to keep it under wraps. So that's my spiel that I've said 900 times, and I will say another 900 times. Um, Census access, that was our original one. So if you need a file in alternative formats, including Braille, it can do that for you. Dyscalculia is like the number version of dyslexia, and I have it. And growing up, there were a lot of things to help kids who were dyslexic with reading, but there was barely anything for dyscalculia. So when I was doing a training, last year on the Microsoft platform, it turned out that OneNote has this algorithm help. I was so excited. Also, because now that I'm a parent, we might have to help our kid with math homework at some point. And we've been talking about who's going to be responsible for this. And I told my husband, like, you're in charge of math homework, but we both have to pitch in. So if I am ever lost, I'm not going to tell my kid, but I can go into OneNote. It'll tell me. It'll do all that math for me, or it'll help me with the algorithms. I was so relieved. That's one of those things you read the fine print, you watch the demos, and you're like, oh, I know something that other people don't know. So I don't know how commonly known this is. I'm not sure I would tell my kid if they didn't have dyscalculia because they might just have it do its homework for them. But I certainly, as a parent, was excited to see this. So the operating systems for Apple and Windows both have pretty good accessibility tools. I would say that Apple's was better up until recently, but Microsoft brought on some really effective um, leaders who have really improved what Microsoft was offering. They're both women, they're both fascinating, they're both very bright. There's been a lot written about them. I have so much respect for them. So Apple has the VoiceOver, which is the screen reader. They have tools to help you focus. They have tools for hearing. Windows has Narrator, reads things out loud. It also has that Microsoft Immersive Reader, which also reads things out loud. Has the magnifier, so that's the zoom in. The speech recognition if you're going to talk to your, I make sure that our clients have headsets. The only problem right now is that some headsets don't work well with hearing aids. So my center and our IT folks are collaborating to see if we can start testing some of the newest headsets on the market, because there are some headsets that they say do work, but they're more expensive. So we don't have the budget for that, but our IT folks do. So they've offered to try to do the research, buy some of these, test them out, see how it goes. There's a font that was specifically created for people who are dyslexic. It's called Dyslexie font. It's mostly free to use and download. I know that the government just set Calibri, I think, as their official accessibility font. But I think it's only for the government. Like universities don't have to use it. Um, Speech recognition. So like Dragon is a really popular one. Text to speech, voice reader. They all have their own names, but they do a lot of the same things. Sometimes you're just trying to remember, what does this do? But it has the same names. So AI is big right now. There's some pros and cons in the accessibility world. So from like a user perspective for things like Chat GPT, like screen readers and keyboard shortcuts, things like Chat GPT aren't very accessible. Flip side is that if you're just someone who's experiencing like brain fog or memory issues, or you're just feeling like overwhelmed by content, you can put it in and it can create meeting notes, outlines, agendas. I've known people who use this to kind of help them get started with a paper. So at first I was like, "You're using ChatGPT for your paper?" And they're like, no, I need an outline to get started because I'm just really unfocused right now. And I thought, okay, well, that's kind of a fair way to go at this. But I still think, they should write their own paper. And this is a big topic at universities. Um, yeah. So I find AI to be useful in certain situations. For example, sometimes I interview people, and instead of taking notes, I just record it either using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or the voice memo on Apple. And then I found a free app called Echo, and it transcribes Apple's voice memos for me. It does a really great job. It's the best on the market in terms of accuracy. And that way I can just listen to them talk and think of questions and write them down instead of also trying to take notes. So, like, I interviewed somebody yesterday. The interview went for an hour and 5 minutes. If I'd had to take notes, I couldn't have also been thinking of questions, writing them down, writing down the answers. Instead, I listened, I wrote down my questions. Later, when I wrote about the interview, there were things I knew I wanted to talk about. Instead of going through an hour-long transcription trying to find this one thing, I just searched for one of the words and I found what I needed. So that was super useful. I did an experiment with Adobe's AI to try to make tactile maps. A lot of my clients have trouble finding my cubicle. I mostly work from home, but for people who have some disabilities, virtual meetings are worse than just meeting in person for them. So I go in and meet with them. And they often have trouble finding my cubicle because just like I'm in a basement that's a maze. So I wanted to create a tactile map, which is often what people who are blind are given for certain things, right? You can 3D print it, and my center has what's called the Open Lab, which is a maker space with 3D printers. So I thought, oh, I'll just like create a 3D version of the basement, and then I'll put something that signifies like this is my cubicle. And then I tried to use AI, and it was a journey. Adobe's AI was not helpful. I thought it was going to do it for me. Turns out you need a lot of color contrast, and something can only be 6 feet tall. So if you're hoping to take pictures of, I don't know, the Statue of Liberty and have it recreate it, not going to happen. Obviously, our walls are taller than 6 feet, and all of the walls are white. There's no distinguishing features. So that was kind of a fail, but Chat GPT can help you write code that, if you don't have time to learn, can be useful, but you need to know what you want it to do, which still requires you to understand how code works. You can't just say, hey, make it do like X. Like, you have to give it very specific things to create. So I wanted it to create this 3D version of part of the blueprint, and it would need to write Ruby code, and it needed a lot of details that I actually was like, I don't think I have those. So there is a lot of possibility there, but it still requires you to think critically. Microsoft has a research lab that created the app called Seeing AI, and it's been a big success. So for somebody who's blind, you download the app on your phone, you can hold it up, and it describes what's being seen. So this would be a better solution than my tactile map. Just putting a sign that said, B23 to the right. That might go better with Seeing AI. But it was interesting to see like what I could and couldn't get from AI, especially what if I was blind and I wanted to create a tactile map? Like, what would it take for me to do that? Could AI do it? And so that was part of the experiment, was like, can we empower the person who needs this to do it on their own? And what would it take for them to do that on their own? And then this is just some resources. I have tons more, but I saw an interesting article about why digital accessibility is key to recruiting a neurodivergent workforce, WCAG guidelines regarding digital accessibility and neurodiversity, a list of Microsoft's accessibility tools for neurodiversity, and then Apple's cognitive accessibility tools. They have different terms, but it all comes down to kind of the same things. So yeah, that's everything I've got, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. That was really great information that you shared. Really helpful. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment
Okay.
in the chat, but I kind of have a question for
Yeah.
myself. You mentioned earlier on about like focusing programs and tools for people
Mhm.
with ADD and ADHD, and I was curious about those and like what that looked like. Mm.
So yeah, I've been actually trying to find some really good ones, and I mean, Apple's focus is good. It's gonna only look at one thing for you, so you're not seeing a lot of stuff behind you. But I don't think that covers everything needed. So obviously, so recently the person who's kind of seen as the guru of some of the guidelines now that people abide by in the user experience design world wrote that he thinks the future of accessibility is using AI to create customized web pages that meet whatever needs you have for your disability. So the idea was like, if you needed to be as, you know, not distracting as possible. I don't know what the right term is there, but you could tell that AI, like, I have ADD, please get rid of anything that's not necessary. But as a lot of people wrote their responses, like, not everybody knows they have disabilities. Not everybody uses assistive technology. A lot of people still don't know what accessibility is. So assuming that they'll go and check these things is a big assumption. Graphic organizing software, like, I do like mind mapping software for writing when you just like have a lot of things going on in your brain and sort of getting it out there, and then it can create an outline for you. I like, but when I've looked for like graphic organizers, It's often just like templates for teachers who teach K through 8. So, like Apple talks about its graphic organizer software, but mostly seems to be, doesn't really seem like the right fit. So I'm always kind of looking for things. And I think a little bit of it is just like testing things out. I did have some software on my computer that wouldn't let me go on the internet for a specific set of time. I used that, but then it wanted me to pay, and I was too cheap to pay. But I know people who have used it very successfully, and I think it is a good idea. I know some people who really have to publish, and so they really have to focus, and so they use that pretty religiously. Um, but I also just use some of the strategies they tell you to use. Like I take a lot of breaks. It's one of the perks of working from home is I don't feel judged if after 20 minutes I get up to go get coffee. I used to worry like, oh, does my boss think I'm just like wasting time by going to get some coffee? I didn't want to seem like that coworker who spends all their time at the water cooler, but I really do need those breaks to be able to kind of regroup. A lot of my job is fixing things and coming up with solutions. And especially in this area of my job, I have a boss, but she's more of an advocate and a manager than she is somebody giving guidance on this. So, like, she's not going to troubleshoot something for me. That is on me to do. Whereas when I did IT support, if something was above my understanding, hey, I don't know, this person has this, I don't really know. And she'd be like, okay, well, yeah. But in this case, I'm really on my own. So I have to be able to figure it out on my own. And so that requires focus and that requires thinking about the problem and the possible solutions. So if I'm unfocused, that's not going to happen. So I really do take a lot of breaks. I found myself coming up with a lot of solutions after I had my kid because one, I don't work as many hours just because I have to like drop him at daycare and come back. So I'm not at my computer right at 8:30 and I don't leave right at 5. I usually leave at 4:30. And then, during my lunch break, I'm doing laundry or loading the dishwasher. So at first I felt, bad because I wasn't working these 8 hours like I would have in the office. But I found myself becoming more effective at work and finding more solutions. And I was surprised because, like, I was running on 4 hours of sleep. I felt like I'm doing all these other things. So I assumed I'd be less focused. But instead, I think a lot of these breaks started really helping me at work. And that's when we created this role. I've been building collaborations with other parts of the university. So it was kind of a big surprise to me when my work got better as I worked less hours and took more breaks. But now I realized like I was told to go for walks a lot, and I always thought, oh, I'm too busy for that, or I forgot. So I had ignored this advice for a long time or had concerns that I would be seen as a slacker. It is really effective though. So I go to the gym 30 minutes. My boss said it's fine if I take 40 minutes from my day because she knows I have ADD. She knows it helps my focus. She'd rather I'm focused than I'm working all 8 hours. So that's been something I've found. But I also say, like, in this role, my personal experience plays a huge part in how my job came to be. I have epilepsy, I have some memory issues. Epilepsy is under control, but I still struggle with the memory. So I've met with an occupational therapist and I do everything they said to do. And then the first time I worked with a client with traumatic brain injury, I was like, well, actually, yeah, I do know what it's like. Um, and she started crying and she was like, you're the first person I've talked to who understands. And then I worked with some folks who were kind of older, and I'd had parents who'd struggled with Alzheimer's. So I can understand kind of what they were going through. My dad struggled with, background noise when he was using his hearing aids. So I was like, yeah, I'm aware that this is a problem. So, you know, they take out their hearing aids because they're at a restaurant and it's just a mess. And I think there's probably some teachers who take out their hearing aids or it wasn't working with their headset. So a lot of this comes down to sort of lived experience and then being interested in finding solutions and seeing what's out there and testing it. I love my job. I have to say, I'm really happy I ended up in a job where like I like it. I don't dread most Mondays. Usually I dread things I have to remember for my kid. Like, do we have all 5 things the teacher said to bring? But this has been really rewarding. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome. Thank you for that. I did have someone in the chat wondering if you're able to share the slides with all the links that
Oh
you
yeah.
provided.
Yeah, I assumed I'd email it to you.
Okay, awesome. And then the other question that we have is from Josh, and he asks, what's the best practice for writing closed captions for 2 people talking at the same time?
That's a good question. And I'm gonna find a resource on that. One of the things I say to my clients that they really appreciate is I don't make things up. I'll get back to you. I'm not going to waste your time. And faculty love hearing that because they feel like everybody's wasting their time. So I don't know the answer, but I will look it up. Our first speaker in our speaker series is going to talk about best practices for captioning. So welcome to come to that, but I can also find resources today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any other
Vivian, I have a
questions.
question.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Hi, Laura. Thanks so much. This is really amazing, and I appreciate Leanne organizing this series for our office. I just had a question, just as someone who has spent most of my career in higher education institutions. Do you find that your role is unique
Yes.
amongst peer education?
Yeah. So we have people who deal with compliance, right? Like that's kind of how this all starts is the ADA and, turning in your paperwork that you have a disability. That part, we have people for that, right? And we have somebody who is an accessibility coordinator, but I think a lot of their job is kind of making sure that this software is compliant and meeting with vendors and working on a lot of initiatives. But there aren't many people at the university who will like sit down with a client and say, yeah, bring your laptop and actually show them how the settings work. And so this just developed out of what I was doing. I mean, I was doing like how to Canvas consults. And a lot of the time when we'd sit down with someone, because they were like, oh, I'm having trouble creating an exam, the blue button isn't there. That's always our red flag. When we hear something like the blue button isn't there, when we've spent thousands of hours looking at the blue buttons, that's a red flag. Either they're having vision issues, um, that's when I start kind of observing them a little more closely. Um, so yeah, there aren't a lot of people who are doing this. I've been sort of tracking people down. I mean, Pitt's pretty big. We're not as big as maybe like University of California, but we're big enough and siloed enough that you really have to intentionally go find these people. So I built a collaboration with our health sciences library because it turned out they were doing a lot of accessibility. And then there were some med students who wanted to do a training on how to make your presentations at conferences accessible because PDFs, like with a lot of the images, are not accessible. There's some software coming out that'll make it easier to pull out like the algorithms and the images and expand them. So we've been working together because I think they teach. So it's finding people who actually teach is kind of, and there's administrators who come to our trainings and then they pass on knowledge. Most of our trainings are kind of a train the trainer. So people go on and share this, and it's figuring out who's doing that and then trying to help them. That's been part of our current mission. And then trying to work with DRS to all get on the same page about what we all can do and work together.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Awesome. I do want to be mindful of time, so it is at 12 o'clock. And I'm not seeing any more questions. But thank you so much